Well, welcome everyone. I think we may as well begin with some of the preliminaries before we get into the more exciting part of this. But just I wanted to start by welcoming everyone. We're in many, many different places, but many of us are in Kingston. And I just wanted to acknowledge that we are here on occupied and unceded land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples here in Kingston. And I think this theme and topic of colonialism and settler colonialism will be relevant to today's event. My name is Adnan Husain, and I teach medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history here at Queen's. And I also direct the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project. If you're not familiar with MSGP, it's an interdisciplinary project sponsoring research, presentations, and lectures by scholars, cultural programming with artists, poets, writers, and community and public education and outreach events related to the Middle East, the Islamic world, and Muslim diasporic experience. And with your support, we hope that it will develop and continue to develop, perhaps with degree programs and other initiatives. So I invite you to explore our website. You can find all the contact information behind me on my screen to connect with us on social media. Join our email list if you want to learn about upcoming events, as well as listen to the podcast we produce called The Majlis, Majlis, and that's available on all the platforms. Today, we're also really delighted to be collaborating with Studies in National and International Development in sponsoring today's lecture, which is by our distinguished guest, Dr. Arun Kundnani, who's the author of a really superb book that I recommend everyone pick up and read, called The Muslims Are Coming: Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror, published by Verso Press in 2014, and a text that I used and my colleague, Dr. Ariel Salzman, used in our team-taught Islamophobia course, like History of Islamophobia. It's a wonderful textbook and covers so many different facets of the topic. And he's also the author previously of The End of Tolerance: Racism in 21st Century Britain, which was published by Pluto Press in 2007. He's also a regular contributor to The Nation, The Guardian, The Intercept, and other online outlets and journals and newspapers. And he's also an editor former editor of a really important and excellent academic journal, Race and Class. Now, these themes about race, Islamophobia, colonialism are, of course, so crucially relevant generally, but our thoughts also are especially on these issues of racism, religious bigotry, and Islamophobia this week, ahead of Canada's National Day of Remembrance and Action Against Islamophobia on Saturday, January 29th, marking the 5th anniversary of the terrible Quebec City Mosque massacre. And we'll be holding other events during this week, including one on January 28th on Islamophobia, his perspectives, global and historical perspectives on it. I'll be on a panel with distinguished colleagues like Dr. Hatem Bazian from Berkeley and Canadian journalist Amira Al-Ghawabi. So do join us then on the 28th, but also on the 29th, where there will be a local vigil held to remember the victims of that terrible attack. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation on a recent episode of The Majlis with Dr. Kundnani, so I'm really eagerly anticipating his lecture this afternoon. So without further ado, let me just mention that it is entitled, "What Was the War on Terror?" To answer that question, we turn it to you, Dr. Kundnani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adnan, and thank you for everyone who's been involved in organising this, and for all of you for joining today to have this conversation. I hope I can give you some things to think about that perhaps the different from how we might normally think about the war on terror and questions of Islamophobia that help us struggle with these events like the massacre in Quebec City and many others. That, you know, the reason that I want us to think about this question of what was the war on terror is because even though you know, this thing we call the war on terror has been with us since October 2001, so more than 20 years now. I feel like we've only scratched the surface in really understanding what we've been living through, and certainly we've not begun the process of thinking about what would it look like for there to be justice for the victims of the war on terror, and accountability for the people who've carried out acts of violence in the name of the war on terror. Although they posed the question in the past tense, I don't mean to imply that we're in some kind of end point. And the question of what would the end of the war on terror look like is itself something that we might get into discussing for the purposes of just opening up that conversation. Let me just say that, you know, the infrastructure of the war on terror remains with us. The infrastructure in terms of all the national security agencies and the kinds of violence they're capable of, the kinds of practices, the kinds of legitimating frameworks, all of that is entrenched and in place. The only thing that's ended is to some extent the kind of rhetoric that was mobilized through the last 2 decades to generate a kind of political energy to institutionalize all of those mechanisms of violence, to get them going. Now that they're in place, now that that infrastructure exists, it actually doesn't need a kind of daily assertion of that rhetoric anymore for it to continue its work. And, you know, there's currently kind of war on terror military actions in something like 85 countries that the United States is involved in. I'll come back to some of that later. But what I want to think about more is how does the war on terror emerge? How does the anti-Muslim racism that's bound up with it emerge? And how can we make sense of that? I want to do that understanding that a large part of what we're talking about here is a form of racism, and hopefully how I understand that will become clear over the next half an hour or so. I think I'll be speaking maybe for a little more than half an hour, and then hopefully that gives us a lot of time for discussion. But for me, racism is a cultural process, but one that operates within a broader political economy. Culture defines the categories by which social meanings are made, but economics determines the interests of different groups defined by those categories. So in analyzing the war on terror, I think we need to think about both the kind of political economy part of it and the kind of cultural processes involved, and the way that those are both kind of intertwined with each other. And what I'm going to argue is that to really understand what's going on with the war on terror, we need to set it in the context of neoliberalism, a word that is so widely used and given so many different meanings that it maybe invites more complexity into the question than might feel like we can handle. But the way that I think about neoliberalism is that it's something that depends on racially coded divisions of labor, and in particular, it depends on rendering vast swathes of the human population kind of superfluous to capitalist production, and hopefully you'll see why that becomes important in what I have to say. But essentially, what my argument is that the kind of projects of counterterrorism that become the war on terror, and we can say the same about the war on drugs, actually, and we can say the same about the process of border fortification that also has the same, I would argue, the same origins and the same chronology, is that all of these kinds of projects are directed at managing these sections of humanity that are deemed surplus to to the core processes of capitalism, and in turn, so that material basis that that kind of political economy around race and surplus populations generates is then the kind of material basis. We're going to meet my daughter. Daddy's doing some work. Yeah, there's lots of people there. So that it provides a kind of material basis for the kind of upsurges of kind of racist rhetoric, nationalist mobilizations, and so on, that then get to flourish under neoliberalism with that material base, right? So all that might sound a bit abstract. Hopefully, it becomes a little clearer as we work through this. Now, and you know, part of the argument here is that the way that most people think about neoliberalism, you know, think about someone like David Harvey, you know, very influential and very, you know, very compelling account of the history of neoliberalism, where it comes from, only tells half the story, because what it does not include in its account a history of the processes of racialization and neo-colonialism that I think are central to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was as much a response to decolonization and things like the Black freedom struggle in the United States, as it was a response to, you know, the part of it that David Harvey focuses on, which is the growing strength of kind of working class movements, socialist politics, and so on. In his account, that he thinks is the impetus for neoliberalism from the end of the 1960s into the early 1970s. You know, on his account, neoliberalism is capitalism's attempt to restore its power after that, after it's thrown into crisis by those mobilizations. Well, crisis is happening in Indonesia, in Ghana, in Palestine, as much as it's happening in, you know, in Western Europe, in the United States, as it's talked about in the conventional accounts. We can. One of the things that I'm arguing is that then what neoliberalism is doing then in response to, you know, what in the late 1960s, early 70s is a kind of mass third world insurgency, and I will get into I think the special relevance of Palestine within that. But a kind of mass third world insurgency. You know, the Pentagon is talking about 30 different armed struggles taking place in different third world settings around about 1970. One of the things that neoliberals are very concerned about is how to discipline, how to manage the threat of these various movements that are coming up, and neoliberalism is interested in how do you use markets to discipline working classes in the West on the one hand, but then how do you use other kinds of discipline to impose market on populations that neoliberals consider to be culturally ill-adapted to market orders. Okay, the neoliberal project is about trying to turn the whole world into a kind of market-mediated world. But its anxiety is that populations outside the West are culturally ill-adapted to consent to that, and so there's this kind of anxiety thrown up around the question of decolonization, of how do we hold these populations outside the West into a market system, and so a kind of new kind of racism emerges in that moment. It signifies things like the figure of the Arab terrorists, the figure of the undocumented migrant, the figure of the narco trafficker, and so on. And so a kind of racial populism emerges around those figures, linked to a kind of counterinsurgency and authoritarianism, backing of authoritarian regimes alongside that. Okay, so what that means is that the racisms that get thrown up by neoliberalism in this moment are not as someone like David Harvey would argue, are not a kind of ornamental feature of neoliberalism that is there to kind of distract from the core contradictions around class, but they are as central antagonisms to neoliberalism as the class antagonisms. They're because they're grounded in this question of the surplus populations. What to do about the surplus populations, right? And so here we can draw on Cedric Robinson's work on racial capitalism, where he says that even in the overdeveloped countries, the Western world, capitalism has not been able to universalize that relationship between labor and capital that is there in the kind of classic definition of something like Volume 1 of Karl Marx's Capital, where he lays out this relationship between, on the one hand, waged workers, on the other hand, owners of capital, and shows how, even though that relationship presents itself as a freely chosen contract between the two sides, in fact there's an exploitation in that. What Robinson is arguing is that, well, there is no tendency, there's no automatic mechanism in capitalism whereby that relationship becomes the overall relationship. Marx didn't always assume that, but often he comes across like he is assuming that eventually everyone will be on one or the other side of this relationship of wage workers or capitalists. Because waged work in capitalism is abstract labor, so it's kind of interchangeable and homogenous. What Robinson is arguing is there's always a differentiation between different categories of labor under capitalism, and race becomes the way that those differences are coded. So it could be the difference between, if you think about plantation slavery in the Americas, you have slaves who are obviously not waged workers. They are within the legal framework of the system. They are the property of others. They are owned. They're capital. And in the same system, you have waged workers. So the cotton that's being produced on the fields of Mississippi is being shipped to by slaves, is being shipped to Manchester, England, to be turned into cloth by waged workers in the factories of the north of England. Then that cloth is being exported to, say, India, and being sold in the context of a monopoly control of textile sales in India, right? So you have the coexistence of different forms of labor within the same system. Race becomes the way that the system tells a story about why the kind of nominally free labor in one part of that system has to coexist with unfree forms of labor in another part of that system. Okay, this is what Robinson means by racial capitalism, right? And it, in a way, like someone like Stuart Hall, who's talking about race as the modality in which classes lived in the 1970s, is making a parallel argument, right? So what does that look like then when we get into the neoliberal age? Well, the racial division of labor in the neoliberal age centers on the division between the kind of dwindling number of waged workers and the multitude of racially coded surplus populations, right? Who Achille Mbembe describes as the unexploitable. In other words, not even able to be exploited in the way that Marx describes in Capital, right? Like that would be almost like a step up for them. And so Mbembe says that their tragedy is that they are unable to be exploited at all. They are abandoned subjects, relegated to the role of a superfluous humanity. And a kind of similar argument by Kalyan Sanyal, the Indian economist, who describes these populations as no longer functioning as, in Marxist terms, a classic reserve army of labor. So in the kind of classic Marxist argument, those workers, well, put it this way, you have a period in the kind of classic story, you have a period of primitive accumulation. In other words, the process whereby through what Marx calls a terrorist violence, people who are engaged in economies of communal ownership of land and subsistence are evicted from that forcefully, thrown up as a kind of population of kind of evictees from these kind of rural economies. They arrive in the towns and cities where the Industrial Revolution in England is absorbing them as now for the first time wage workers. So primitive accumulation generates the people who are going to become the wage workers that capitalism needs. They have to be freed from the land, otherwise they can't be absorbed as wage workers, because if they're still tied to the land, they don't need wages. They can survive by themselves without needing capital. They own their own means of production, which is a communal ownership of the land. So in that's primitive accumulation. What's important here is that in the neoliberal era, that we're seeing primitive accumulation on a huge global scale, evicting people from the land as land is privatized by neoliberalism. But the difference from how Marx describes primitive accumulation in the period of the emergence of capitalism in England, the difference in the neoliberal era for the third world, for the global south, is there isn't a industry to absorb those populations into waged work, so they become a surplus. Okay, and this is what Sanya was talking about. Then, in the classic account, those people who can't be absorbed into wage work in the English history fall into what's called the reserve army of labor. They're in and out of wage work, and they become a kind of safety valve for the system. Because there's a few people in the population who are outside of wage work, it enables wages to be held down and so on. But in the neoliberal era, these people aren't even they aren't even a reserve army of labor, like occasionally coming into the wage labor. They're completely outside, they're surplus, okay? And this is what Sanyal describes as from the point of view of capitalism, is a kind of wasteland inhabited by the excluded who'll never be incorporated into capitalist development. And for them, he says, capitalism has done the work of dispossession through primitive accumulation, but then failed to find them a place within the system of capitalist production. But so bereft of any direct access to means of labor, the dispossessed are left only with labor power, but their exclusion from the space of capitalist production does not allow them to turn their labor power into a commodity by obtaining some kind of wage. So they are condemned to the world of the excluded, the redundant, the dispensable, having nothing to lose, not even the chains of wage slavery. The doors of the world of capital remain forever closed. The wasteland is a space outside capital that challenges the latter's universality. Hence, it generates a kind of anxiety. It's a focus for all the anxieties of neoliberals and capitalists as to the limits of their project, right? And so my argument is that from the point of view of racial capitalism, the war on terror is a solution to the problem of how to police this wasteland. Okay, that's my kind of core argument. So, and here I want to draw on the work of Stuart Hall and his colleagues in their book Policing the Crisis, which I think was published in the late 70s, but remains, again, it's one of those texts from that period that remains indispensable, I think, for understanding so much of how today's world works. And so they're analyzing the moral panic in Britain in the 1970s around the idea of the black mugger, which we see in Britain in the 1970s, this kind of media and policy frenzy around this concept of the threat of the black mugger on the streets of England's cities. And in this book, their argument is that this panic is really a kind of displaced fear of the black radical. So there's a kind of process whereby there's a fear of black radicalism, which then is kind of reframed as a kind of fear of the black mugger, a kind of transference. And the fear of black radicalism in turn is a kind of displacement of a kind of general fear of political insurgency, which so the black mugger becomes a kind of signifier for all these other tensions. Okay, and I think something very similar is at play when we think about the figure of the Muslim terrorist, that's obviously central to the war on terror. So, and the history here, I think, is really something that begins in the late 1960s and early 1970s is the kind of formative period. And in the US context, I mean, I think the story is different in different settings, but in the US context, I think the question of Palestine becomes central to how this figure emerges. So I think, so to understand this, I think it's important to understand that, so before 1960, if we think about the question of Palestine, before 1967, the question of Palestine in the United States is a matter of diplomacy. Okay, it's about the neighboring Arab governments and their attempts through diplomatic means and occasionally through military action to advance the Palestinian cause, right? And so you find that it's a very much a, you know, look at the discourse around Palestine in the United States in that pre-1967 period. It's very much a matter of kind of fairly regular kind of questions of international relations and so on, right? What changes in 1967 is that the Palestinians realize that their cause is not going to be won by relying on the neighboring Arab governments. And that becomes clear after the 67 war when, you know, which is a defeat for Egypt in particular, right? And so that's when you get the emergence of the PLO and the emergence of Yasser Arafat as a leader of the Palestinian cause, now understood as not something that is integrated into the Arab nation states as advocates for this cause, but as a popular insurgency, right? The idea now is that the struggle is rooted in the Palestinian people themselves, not centered on a particular government or states. It's not state-centered anymore. It's a popular insurgency, right? And it's that changes how the Palestinian struggle is understood in US foreign policy discourse. It now shifts into something else. It starts to become racialized, most importantly, as and the next kind of key moment is in 1973, when, if you remember, you have the oil embargo with Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf Arab states announcing in 1973 that they will cease the supply of oil to the United States for so long as the United States does not take action to rein in Israel's military occupation of Palestine and find some kind of solution for the Palestinian cause. And so this is, you know, this is hugely significant for a number of reasons. So firstly, you know, we're dealing here with very conservative regimes. They're not by any means attempting to advance some kind of radical politics. They're doing a kind of performance of a kind of pan-Arab nationalism. Their goal, their goal is really to integrate themselves as a kind of wealthy element within the broader kind of US-led system. But it sends shockwaves through the United States, because what's happening is that the question of Palestinian liberation, which is a popular insurgency, is now being linked to the most important resource in the world economy, oil, right? And if you look at the kind of, you know, if you read Foreign Affairs at that time, the kind of house journal of US imperialism, you know, you begin to see the language that is now completely familiar to us around how you know, policy makers in DC start to have these anxieties about, well, what does jihad mean? What does Sharia mean? You know, this sense that there's some kind of cultural issue that is of deep concern to policymakers in DC, and you know, their argument that they're making at this time is, look, there is a cultural phenomenon amongst Arabs of a kind of a propensity to radicalism, to like overthrowing the system, and the danger that we have is that unfortunately, this kind of cultural propensity to radicalism exists in this place where most of the oil is. That means that were these radicals to come to power in the Middle East, they can use the control of oil, and literally they'll be saying, perhaps in a third world Marxist alliance with China, this is the kind of thing they were talking about, to kind of threaten the whole capitalist system. Okay, and so the question of Arab radicalism takes on this kind of especially fraught kind of tone in the way that foreign policy makers in DC are talking about it. But importantly, what they're doing is they're not saying, look, here's a political conflict, a political antagonism between a third world nationalist liberation movement in Palestine and our interests, which are politically opposed to that. But that's not how they're putting the problem. They're reframing it away from that idea of a political antagonism to the idea of a cultural problem. Like, the problem is that their culture prevents them from adjusting to the correct, rational, modern market system that we are leading and trying to establish around the world, right? So it's not our politics that's the problem, it's their culture. That becomes the kind of the simple explanation, and the understanding of culture within that is as something that's fixed, that determines your whole behavior of a people in these very mechanical ways. So it does the same kind of work that in the 19th century a concept of race would have done in a more kind of biological way. And then if you think about how that then starts to register in all kinds of ways in popular culture in the United States, the emergence of the stereotype of the kind of wealthy Arab sheikh who's able to manipulate the world economy, a stereotype that emerges in the news media and in kind of Hollywood around that time in the 1970s, that is a cousin of the anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jewish conspiracy. So that's starting to get going. Already in 1972, the Nixon administration issues a set of directives known as Operation Boulder, which would have enabled the FBI and the CIA to coordinate with the pro-Israel lobby organizations in the United States to subject pro-Palestinian political activists to surveillance and harassment. From the late 1970s, you get the pro-Israel lobby in the United States beginning to use these arguments about Arab culture to try and reframe how the US public understands the Israel-Palestine issue, to try and argue that the issue is a matter of Western values versus this less advanced Arab culture, rather than a political issue of a military occupation, human rights violations, a people engaged in a political struggle for their own liberation, right? So you see a series of conferences in Washington, D.C. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, organized by Benjamin Netanyahu, who's then the Israeli ambassador to the UN, in which they try and promote this idea that terrorist violence is endemic. Initially, it's promoted as it's endemic to Arab culture because of this kind of inherent Arabic radicalism. But then by the 1980s, after the key event being the revolution in Iran in 1979, they talk a lot more about a kind of inherent relationship of Islam to terrorism. This is, kind of where this argument that now is so familiar to us and so central to Islamophobic discourse today, is where this really gets going in the US context. And as I say, the argument is, you can see how, from an Israeli point of view, this is an excellent form of messaging because it enables a kind of argument for why the US and Israel alliance has to be upheld in the face of this kind of cultural threat from racial, ethnic, religious others. Rather than think about this in terms of, the other language you might use to think about this, and it's starting to happen in the 1980s in the United States. People are starting to talk about, the question of human rights in Palestine, and the question of this being an occupation, which brings with it its own set of legal implications, in terms of international law. People are starting to use that language. Israel's saying, well, no, this is a matter of, that's the wrong language to understand what's going on. Instead, you want to use the language of cultural values, this idea of Western values versus Arab or Muslim difference, right? And obviously, with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, in particular, the hostage taking that's on US media every night for a long time, this is then the moment when this idea, this association of Islam with an idea of fanaticism, of irrationality, of barbarism, really starts to take hold. And then with the end of the Cold War, liberal democratic capitalism is kind of pronounced as victorious by Washington. The world appears to have entered a period in which these kind of grand ideological conflicts are over. Francis Fukuyama is talking about the end of history. Even the African National Congress in South Africa, after it comes to power with the end of apartheid in 1994, proclaims a kind of allegiance to neoliberalism. So even that kind of heroic popular insurgency that's running through the 1980s and so on, seems like it can be incorporated into this market order that neoliberals want to uphold. All those kind of ideas of third world movements coming together. Think of the Bandung idea from the 1950s, but it takes various forms over the following decades. All those ideas coming from third world leaders, third world movements, that there might be some way to redistribute wealth globally to remedy the legacies of colonialism and so on. I mean, if the ANC can't even talk that language, then no one else is going to be able to in the 1990s. And so it seems like everywhere, neoliberalism is one. The one exception to that that's at least visible, kind of at the, in terms of the kind of public discourse, is Palestine, right? Where although the PLO leadership are signed up to the Oslo process, which effectively is an attempt to incorporate the Palestinian struggle into the status quo. The majority of Palestinians are not supportive of it, and key figures in the movement are opposed to it. So Palestine becomes again this kind of exception to the kind of neoliberal order. And therefore, again, becomes the kind of focus for all the anxieties that maybe this market system, this market order that we're trying to impose, can't be made universal, and that it is going to run up against these kind of cultural limits. All those anxieties are kind of then condensed into the question of Palestine, which because of the way that that's been interpreted over the 80s and so on, becomes then connected to the question of Islam, right? And then you have writers such as Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington arguing in the 1990s that the reason that you get what they see as this kind of Palestinian intransigence is again not the politics of Israel and the United States and the politics of military occupation, but their culture, right? The clash of civilizations thesis that Huntington and Lewis develop is essentially an argument that culture is determining, and that because of the nature of Islam culturally, that it is inevitably going to be in this kind of antagonism, this clash with the West, right? And so Islam then becomes the new enemy to replace communism, because remember, for neoconservatives, you need, as they say themselves, you need an enemy to unite, to stitch up the kind of fractures in your own society and unite your own society. You need an external enemy to enable that, and for Huntington, he says the ideal enemy for America would be ideologically hostile, racially and culturally different, and militarily strong enough to pose a credible threat to American security. And so Islam, he argues, becomes the candidate. Now, to the figure of the Muslim terrorist that emerges in this, and remember, this is all before 9/11. The figure of the Muslim terrorist is already, by the 1990s, then is already, I think, functioning as a displaced signifier of neoliberalism's failure to universalize itself in a way that is a kind of global analog of the figure of the black mugger that Stuart Hall talks about in the 1970s. So anti-Muslim racism is already then the arena within which complex fears and tensions and anxieties generated by neoliberalism and its discontents are being kind of projected and worked through. And then with the war on terror in its post 9/11 form, the global policing of Muslims then kind of meshes with the broader problem of policing neoliberalism's surplus populations, both within and without the West. So what's happening then is, with the kind of sedimentation of these processes into national security agencies, and we start to get a set of goals established for national security policy that really consolidate after 9/11, but they're already there before then. What is that? Well, I think the logic is for the national security state, it's the idea that the goal is to integrate Muslims into what they call a liberal society, right? And this becomes the kind of ideological center of the national security thinking here. And so their project is to distinguish between what they call moderate Muslims and extremist Muslims. Okay, this becomes very important in how the war on terror plays out. So the moderate is offered a form of inclusion. The extremist is subjected to state violence. Okay, but since the moderate is always perceived as being at risk of becoming an extremist, all Muslims are continually suspect. Right. So war on terror administrators talk about radicalization, this keyword that emerges suddenly out of nowhere, really, 2004, 2005. No one talked about radicalization in relation to terrorism before then, but suddenly that word is everywhere. 2004, 2005. What is radicalization within this national security language? It's the process by which moderates are kind of gripped by what's considered an extremist version of Islam, and that then transforms them in this argument to violent fanatics, right? And so then we see these kind of vast systems of surveillance that are established to try to identify the would-be extremist Muslims that are hidden amongst the moderates. And of course, in practice, the classifying of moderate and extremist is not done on the basis of some kind of consistent and explicit criteria. It's very fluid. Moderate Muslims are defined as, for example, those who restrict their religion to the private sphere, but they're also expected to publicly condemn interpretations of Islam that Western governments consider dangerous. Moderate Muslims are supposed to value freedom of speech, but they're considered extremists if they use their freedom of speech to criticize the West. Moderate Muslims are required to publicly condemn the use of violence to achieve political ends, but when the US government uses violence to achieve its political ends, then condemnation has to give way to consent. Officially, Muslim extremism is defined as a rejection of liberal values, but in practice, the term is almost always used to label Muslims who oppose Western power in whatever way they do so. As I say, so then within this framework, moderate Muslims have what is regarded as their cultural identity celebrated actually within a framework of diversity and inclusion. So, think of all those resources that were deployed through the war on terror to kind of promote an idea of a depoliticized, passive kind of mainstream Islam, a cuddly Islam, all those art exhibitions that got government funding and so on to kind of promote this idea of Islam that was considered acceptable. And then on the other hand, extremist Muslims have their mosques and community organizations closed down, their speech criminalized, their bank accounts frozen, their clothing regulated, even their citizenship cancelled. If they live in certain parts of the Middle East, Africa, or South Asia, subject to execution from the air by missile-bearing drones or transportation to secret locations to face torture and indefinite imprisonment. In the cases of Afghanistan and Iraq, entire countries invaded, occupied, destroyed. Researchers at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University have documented that the deaths of around 500,000 people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan as a direct result of the war on terror from October 2001 to October 2019. Around half of those deaths are thought to be of civilians. And of course, this is a highly conservative estimate because it only counts those deaths directly caused by war and those which can be documented in some kind of news reporting or something like that. The actual death toll of the war on terror is going to be much, much higher. Most of the deaths haven't been counted by anyone, and many more people will have died as a indirect result of wars that destroy the infrastructure of food, of healthcare, of water, and so forth. So we simply don't know how many men, women, and children have been needlessly killed by the United States and its partners in the war on terror. But the number is definitely over 1 million people. At the same time, over 14 million Iraqis and Afghans have been forced to flee their homes in fear of their lives. The overwhelming majority are violently prevented from seeking sanctuary in the United States or the other wealthy countries who share responsibility for their displacement. And so a seemingly mundane fact that's kind of worthy of note, I think, here to think about this is that this mass violence of the war on terror has not required, hasn't required actually any special agencies to carry it out, right? That it's the regular militaries, the regular intelligence agencies, the regular law enforcement agencies, the regular border agencies, the private contractors, the regular courts. So the question is, how was this level of violence possible on this scale, administered through the ordinary processes of nominally liberal states, right? And I think the only way to answer that question is to think about the particular form of racism that was bound up with it. And here, the former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair, one of the key architects of the war in Iraq, he described the violence of the war as being aimed not at regime change, the phrase that was always used at that time, but what he called values change, right? It seems to me this is really crucial here. So, he'd been influenced by neoconservative scholars such as Bernard Lewis to believe that Iraqi cultural values were so antagonistic to Tony Blair's idea of liberal modernity that only a war to tear apart the kind of very social fabric of Iraq would be only that would make it possible to create the new kind of Iraq that Blair and other neoconservatives envisioned. So as he put it, the war was part of an elemental struggle about the values that will shape our future. A war not just against terrorism, but about how the world should govern itself in the early 21st century, right? That's pretty clear, right? That's the logic of the war on terror. Actually, in a nutshell there, what he's saying is that he holds this violence to be necessary, not actually primarily to prevent terrorism, but in order to bring about a kind of cultural change among Muslims around the world. And that's not often made explicit, but that's the argument really of the war on terror. that the cultural problems in Islam are so deeply embedded in their view that they can only be dealt with through the kind of industrial violence that destroys millions of lives. And this is why anti-Muslim racism is indispensable to the war on terror. Only by imagining barbarism as somehow a kind of natural feature of Islam can you then get war, torture, assassination, arbitrary imprisonment presented as necessary. So what anti-Muslim racism is doing here is setting aside all the kind of contingent social and political factors that create the conditions in which Muslims do indeed sometimes commit terrifying acts of violence, and instead seeing their actions as simply the kind of automatic expression of an Islamic culture of fanaticism. And then we can tell ourselves that their Muslim violence reflects the deep flaws in their culture, while our much greater violence is a kind of rational or even liberal program of trying to modify their barbaric behavior. Right. So, and genocidal violence doesn't always announce itself in the rhetoric of overt hatred. It can also be couched in this kind of managerial language of cultural reform. So, what does this mean in terms of how we think about taking this on? As I said at the beginning, the kind of global infrastructure of violence that the war on terror has created is still with us. An implication of what I've been arguing is that this kind of anti-Muslim racism can't be opposed by the usual kind of demands for kind of liberal tolerance, or by demands for empathy, or understanding of the cultural differences of our fellow Muslim citizens. Like that logic is already embedded within the war on terror as part of how moderate Muslims are supposed to be included into the system. It doesn't capture really, it doesn't kind of cut into what's really going on here if we take that approach. Because the true demand is not to have a culture tolerated, but equal participation in how the future of the world is shaped. That's really the kind of political challenge here. It's not a struggle about cultural differences, but about the social and political antagonisms that those cultural differences are expressions of. And so it's not a question of, can we find a way to make Muslim culture compatible with Western values in the United States or Canada or Europe or wherever, but a question of who gets to decide what values should govern how the United States, Canada, or Western Europe are governed. And can a United States or a Canada or Western Europe be imagined that is free of its histories of racism and colonialism and imperialism? It's not how do we integrate Muslims into the West, but how does the West integrate itself into the rest of the world, given those histories, right? And the Black freedom movement of the 1960s and 1970s in particular argued that racism and capitalism and imperialism are kind of intertwined aspects of the same system, right? But it's the same system that produces imperialist wars, such as the war in Vietnam, and racism at home, in the form of segregation, exploitation, police violence, and so all the other things that people were trying to challenge. And so for them, the Black freedom movement was a kind of struggle against US imperialism, as at home. So they were trying to make organic connections between the struggle within what they called internal colonialism with the United States and the external colonialism of the United States in, say, Puerto Rico, say, Vietnam, and so on, right? And it seems to me that the same principle applies when we think about the war on terror and how we need to understand our movements for justice in response to it. We need to make the same connections between the kind of domestic racisms and the global empire. We need to be able to connect the kind of militarized killing of people on the streets of US cities with the militarized killing of people in other parts of the world. To trace the links between the prison industrial complex within the United States and the so-called black sites of the war on terror, incarceration, around the world, to see the connections between the war on terror, the war on drugs, war on immigration. And we need to see how these wars are part of the reason why the US spends far more public money on death, on killing, on violence than it does on providing the basic needs for life, for healthcare, for education to working class Americans. Now, as scholars, our basic commitment should be to human liberation beyond any kind of partial affinities to particular nation states. The questions that we should be asking of scholars, I think, working in this area, producing knowledge around these questions, are the questions that were posed in a 1974 editorial in the journal Race and Class, of which I'm on the editorial board. And in that editorial, it says, what good is your knowledge to us? Do you, in your analyses of our social realities, tell us what we can do to transform them? Does your apprehension of our reality speak to our experience? Do you convey it in a language that we can understand? If you do none of these things, should we not only reject your knowledge, but in the interests of our own liberation, consider you a friend to our enemies and a danger to our people? And unfortunately, so much of the scholarship in this area falls into the category of that kind of knowledge that is not in the interest of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kundnani, for those remarks covering a very wide sweep of history and very interesting analysis about how to situate Islamophobia. I think the floor is open for questions. You can put them. We have, about 30 minutes or so for question and answer and discussion. You can either use the raise hand function, and then we'll arrange to unmute you so you can ask your question directly, or you can drop it into the chat, and we will also be taking questions from the Facebook live stream. So if you are watching this through that medium and you put a question in the comments, we will make sure that these get to us and we can pose them to our speaker. Right now I don't have a hand up, but I do see that somebody has put in a question from Ross Campbell, who says, thank you. What are the relationships with the West's war on terror, with the war on any tendencies towards self-determination or political engagement by Muslim populations, aka Islamism or radical Islam, from all sorts of authoritarian states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, China, Burma, Ethiopia, etc.?
Thank you, Ross. I'm assuming I'm not sure what what you're getting at really with that question, but I'll have a go at trying to make sense of you. But feel free to come back and clarify if I've misunderstood or I'm barking up the wrong tree. But I mean, I would say that when we think about, so the war on terror is a political, to me, ultimately what it boils down to is a political conflict between Western governments and non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda and others, right? And but then through the way in which that conflict is understood, it becomes something much broader, so that within the theory of radicalization, these ideas of political Islam, Islamism, radical Islam, I mean, there's a whole load of terms here that become important. Some people start to talk about Salafi Islam and so on. That those become seen as part of the problem that needs to be dealt with in order to deal with Al-Qaeda, right? So there's a kind of initial question of a group like Al-Qaeda or these non-state actors that are involved in acts of violence, and then beyond. And then the kind of secondary question is these Islamist groups, and then a kind of third level is the question of the culture that throws up all of this, right? Which is again broader, once more calling into I mean, then it starts to apply to the entire population, right? And so what you'll see in the national security world is these kind of diagrams of like a kind of pyramid with the, at the bottom level is the entire Muslim population with its culture, right? That generates certain propensities. And then the next level up is political Islam. So groups that are engaged in what in the national security world is considered the same agenda as Al-Qaeda ideologically, but are not engaged in violence to obtain it. And then the top level is the groups that are engaged in violence to try to achieve that agenda. And radicalization is the process of moving up that pyramid, right? So what that ignores is that in any conflict, you need both sides in that conflict to constitute the conflict, right? What is going on with the war on terror is two sides in the conflict, at least two sides in the conflict, engaged in violence, and each side is deciding what forms of violence and what level of violence to deploy based on how it interprets the actions of the other side. The film The Battle of Algiers depicts this very clearly. The whole film takes you through how each side in the conflict in Algeria interprets the violence of one side and then decides what to do in response in terms of its own calculations about the violence it feels it needs to deploy to achieve its goals. So the same is going on with the war on terror. So the relationship is crucial. It's an interactive relationship, but the way that we tend to think about what we call terrorist violence is that that famous phrase about 9/11, it came out of the blue sky, right? It didn't come out of the blue sky. It came out of a history, right, in which Western governments were themselves acting to contribute to the conditions in which 9/11 became possible, right? One of those contributions was, of course, famously the fact that the kinds of groups that end up as something like Al-Qaeda in the 1990s were groups that were supported by the United States in the 1980s in the context of the Cold War conflict in Afghanistan, right? And that's a much broader picture where, across Muslim majority countries and amongst Muslim minorities in the West, in the last decade or two of the Cold War, the Western strategy was to support groups that we would now maybe label as Islamists, on the grounds that these were the best placed allies in the fight against communism in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Indonesia, in Africa, and so on, right? So yesterday's friends become today's enemies, right? That doesn't. I don't think we should think of that as a matter of. There's also within that a story about how there's a genuine mobilization going on around Muslim communities to the banner of these organizations, which seem in the 1990s to represent some kind of genuine alternative in that moment of neoliberal victory of what was called globalization. Like these organizations seem to offer their own alternative globalization of a kind of transnational identity of the ummah, that tends to all get ignored. What gets focused on is this idea that these so the initial account after 9/11 is these groups came out of the blue. Later we get these more elaborate ideas of radicalization that talk about a trajectory from Muslim culture to Muslim radicalism to Muslim terrorism.
Great. Well, we have a number of questions in the chat. So Yasmin Jerbal well, first says, thank you, Dr. Kundnani. And I should point out that Yasmin has written a fantastic dissertation on Islamophobia in
Mm.
Canada and France, and also looked at de-radicalization kind of programs in these two places. But she asks, I was wondering if you could speak to the competing political and social interests enmeshed with neoliberalism, and how the figure of the Muslim terrorist continues to be mobilized. Specifically, I'm thinking about how this rhetoric has been used by countries such as China, for example, to police, control, and disappear Uyghur populations, or in Europe generally, and France in particular, to control, police, and disavow its Muslim population. And we might add, along with Tamina, who said also we're seeing something like this in India. So maybe you could talk about the global adoption, you might say, and circulation of the war on terror beyond just the US's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot to figure out here, and I'm not sure that I'm able to give a very developed answer, and I'm certainly no expert on India, China, or France. But I can give you some thoughts. What I would say is, in the case of, in the case of, there's a lot of Asian countries now where you see something happening that over the last 10 years or so, where longer histories of something like ethnic conflict, kind of have a discussion about what the most appropriate language would be, but something like an ethnic conflict of a kind that that is very common in countries that have got a history of colonialism. Something like those ethnic conflicts then in the last 10 years kind of gets mapped through a new kind of language of Islamophobia, in which all of that mobilization of Islamophobic rhetoric that comes out of the United States and out of Western Europe with these very well-funded kind of campaigns and networks, then starts to travel to these other places. And it's not that it's just kind of adopted by these other places, but it's there's an appropriation that is about borrowing from these discourses originating in the West and reworking them in very specific ways to the local history and the local situation, right? It's like it's almost like that idea that every this was the 90s idea that every region of the world would have its own sort of version of MTV that would be slightly different from the kind of the way that MTV was originally conceived in the United States. And so you have this kind of what was called glocalization, right? It's a glocalization of Islamophobia, right? And so, in the Indian context, obviously, you have the question of communalism that is a product, to a large part, not entirely, but to a large part, is a product of the early 20th century political history in India of colonialism, and I don't call it divide and rule. I think Mahmoud Mamdani's phrase is more apt here, is define and rule. Like, what colonialism is doing is not dividing these pre-existing populations, but is defining these populations and then ruling over them through that defining process, right? And so the very idea of what it means to be a Muslim or what it means to be a Hindu is actually being constituted through things like the census in India in the late 19th century, through the colonial bureaucracy that's been created to manage through difference, right? To rule through difference. That's an aspect of how British colonialism worked in India. So that then, by the time you get to 1947, that's obviously the history of then partition, and the partition of India in 1947 is not a one-off event. It's an ongoing process that continues to unfold. The boundaries of Indian national sovereignty are constantly, in all kinds of ways, are subject to kind of political contest, right? that is one of the kind of conditions then for it to be possible for there to be a kind of flow of Islamophobic, it's almost on the level of the memes themselves, this kind of flow of these Islamophobic memes between the kind of Islamophobic networks in Western Europe and in the United States, and these networks within India. Obviously, Hindutva networks are central to this, right? Now, and part of what's going on there is, I would suggest, an idea that, so what the war on terror framing does, as I've argued, is it sets up this idea of the West and Islam, and represents Islam as culturally antagonistic to the West and to modernity, right? And so, for India, for a country like India, there's a certain way in which Islamophobia functions as a discourse of modernization, right? It's the argument that even though how Hindutva politics thinks about modernity is incredibly interesting and not straightforward at all, but part of what's going on with how Hindutva talks about Islam is as a barrier to modernity, modernization of India, even though modernization for them doesn't quite mean the same thing as westernization, right? Now, and I'd argue something similar is going on with the way that Islamophobia is playing out in Russia, for example. I think it's very similar in that on that level at least, right? And China's interesting, where like if you read the way that the Chinese Communist Party talks about terrorism, they have quite openly and directly copied and it's a copy and paste from the US national security language, right? In that case, right? I mean, the particular history there is different, the particular politics is different, but it's very striking that they have literally imported the counter-radicalization narratives from Western policymakers, and that becomes there's a translation, and that becomes the language they use to think about what they're doing with the Uyghurs there. France, I mean, it's become, I must say that I find in the last kind of 4 or 5 years, I don't feel like I can keep pace with how much is happening in France on this question, and how far France has gone down the road of a kind of deep-seated Islamophobia that seems to be absolutely central to the political process with the election this year, that has. It seems to me that is now a unique space within Europe. Within Islamophobia in Europe, it seems to me to be its own thing now, and in a way that I don't think I can fully describe and analyze at this point, but terrifies me. And clearly, the beginnings of an analysis would have to be that a recognition of France's colonial history, the fact that in France, and this is true for most of Western Europe, for reasons that have nothing to do with Islam itself, there's a tight relationship between being Muslim and being and questions of class, right? Because by and large, the Muslim populations in Western Europe are the descendants of people who've come to live there to do the jobs that the existing white populations didn't want to do or were allowed not to do, and so the and part of that is also about a neoliberal transformation. And the way that migrant workers then become a kind of solution to all kinds of contradictions within neoliberalism. So so that much we can say, but the specific kind of chemistry of what's going on there in France today is unique, I think, and terrifying.
Well, we have a couple other questions that have come in. There's one that's about the impact on domestic Muslim populations in Canada, and you might want to say about other places that I think may also connect with the second question. So, in terms of your response, and let me sort of group those together. Tamina Bukhari says, how much does the war on terror impact Muslim communities in places like Canada to become more insular? How much does the problem feed itself with a vicious cycle where the majority are not building bridges with other communities or fully seeing themselves as Canadian and able to fully engage outside the Muslim group? But we also have, I think maybe connected, is from Adam Ali, who I'll also say wrote a wonderful dissertation on de-radicalization in sport. Says, my research focuses on, I get to sit on all these committees here at Queen's, but there's great work being done. My research focuses on the intersection of anti-Islamic racism, radicalization, and sport. I explore the way that sport is utilized as a tool of de-radicalization and/or integration within Western host societies. Such initiatives have been taken up by the UN and other international entities. I'm wondering if you had any comments regarding the rise of the de-radicalization industry more generally and how it fits into the contemporary war on terror landscape. So I hope I wasn't anticipating and thinking that there might be some connection between the marginalization and isolation of Muslim communities domestically in places like Canada, elsewhere, and these so-called de-radicalization programs.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I mean, I think I'm sure most of the people in this conversation probably, or a lot of people would be better placed to think about the specifics of how this plays out in Canada than I am. But what I would say is, I don't think that that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of idea that you were kind of introducing. I don't find that plausible myself. I don't think that there is a way in which, I mean, it's certainly true, right? That there are forms of segregation that come into play, right? But segregation is never something that's self-chosen, right? It's always something that's structurally imposed, and so it's never the case that by like it's back to front to think that it's the segregation that causes the exclusion and the perceptions of being different, the perceptions of being outside of mainstream society. If in a way it's the other way around. There's the structural forces that create the segregation and at the same time create the image of this population as being outsiders and being as not belonging, right? The two things go hand in hand. In Britain, in the summer of 2001, there was a series of uprisings in some of the northern towns in England where predominantly Muslim communities entered into kind of pitched battles with police, and it's one of those. Every 10 years or so in Britain, there's an event like that, and at different times, it's different communities are involved. It's part of the kind of urban history of Britain, really, over the 20th century and into this century, right? And on that particular occasion, the participants happened to be working class Muslim young people, and so the sort of official explanation that was developed after that was, these communities have chosen to self-segregate because of their cultural difference from mainstream society. And then that self-segregation in turn has generated a perception by others in these towns that that these Muslims are outsiders, and that has created this set of tensions that then led to this violence. And I mean, what that is doing is disavowing, hiding, concealing all the histories of institutional racism that create that segregation, and therefore having created it, attached to it an image of these people as somehow being outside, right, outside the mainstream, and then imagining that somehow that was something that they chose, or that comes out of their culture. And you know, the kind of empirical evidence for that argument, it just isn't there. Now on the de-radicalization question, you know, like, I think, yes, so this is very striking that you see, you know, so the first thing that's really striking about this is you get in 2004, 2005, a kind of crisis in the war on terror, right, in which the sort of immediate post 9/11 form of the war on terror no longer seems to be working. And what was that form? That form was, you know, we will go to war to capture the leaders of these non-state organizations like Al-Qaeda, or kill them, and we will go to war to do regime change, to overthrow the regimes that are supporting terrorism. Allegedly, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, actually that claim was false. So 2004, 2005, that clearly isn't working. There's a lot more violence happening from groups like Al-Qaeda than before the war on terror began. You're getting bombings in European cities, not just by people who are coming to Europe from other parts of the world, but by people who are born and bred in Europe. And so a new strategy needs to be developed. And what you get is the idea of radicalization kind of becoming the key idea to rethink how the war on terror might work. If you like, it's now the liberal war on terror rather than the neoconservative war on terror. And the liberal argument is we need to be much better about understanding the complex process by which extremism is generated. It's a social process, a cultural process, a psychological process. You know, people have different ideas, and much more smart about how we intervene in those processes to stop radicalization. And what that means is that now the war on terror is not something that's just coming out of the Pentagon, you know, or military parts of the government, but is in every part of the government. Because if you're starting to say, well, we need to be much more, you know, tightly focused on individual Muslims, individual Muslim communities, individual Muslim organizations, institutions, and we need to know much more precisely what's going on in each of them so that we can distinguish between the moderate Muslims who we want to win over to our side and the extremist Muslims who we want to identify and act on. You know, a kind of counterinsurgency thinking, really. If that's the project, then it might be that the people who are best placed to identify and spot what are taken to be those warning signs as indicators that someone is radicalized, right? It might be that the person best placed to spot that is not the FBI agent or the intelligence agencies or the police officer, but the teacher, the youth worker, the sports coach, the doctor, you know, and so that was the prevent policy in Britain, was that logic. Training hundreds of thousands of public sector workers, not police public sector, but public sector workers in spotting the so-called signs of radicalization based on completely bogus ideas of what radicalization was. And essentially institutionalizing an Islamophobic gaze into the public sector in Britain, and then expecting all of these figures to be the kind of eyes and ears of the surveillance, of the national security surveillance system, and pass on this information to police departments, intelligence agencies, and so on. You know, and that's how we ended up with, you know, nursery school teachers teaching 4-year-olds, you know, having them being trained in supposedly spotting the signs of radicalization in a 4-year-old. And then, you know, actually you know, we had cases where we found out that like large numbers of 4-year-olds were being reported to the police for supposedly being radicalization, you know, going through radicalization. And that was something that you know, the police would then investigate their families. Yeah, optometrists receiving training on how to spot the signs of of radicalization. So you're going to get your glasses fitted, and supposedly you might be in that interaction displaying the indicators that you're becoming an extremist Muslim, right? Across the whole of public life, and this is the policy that has been adopted around the world. It's been globalized, right? So-called countering violent extremism policies. You see them everywhere. The UN has promoted them. The EU has promoted them. They're in Canada in a different form. They're in the United States, right? And so because the logic of this approach is to say, we're not, obviously, if it's someone who's involved in, something that can be subject to a criminal prosecution according to the very widely drawn set of actions that can be defined as criminal under the Terrorism Act, which in everywhere nowadays means that all kinds of forms of what used to be considered legitimate speech, legitimate organizing work, legitimate use of the internet and so on now constitutes a criminal offense under terrorism laws. Beyond things that can be dealt with like that, which obviously would if identified would warrant a police or some kind of police law enforcement investigation and possible prosecution. Other kinds of like warning signs of radicalization which haven't reached the criminal threshold then require some other kind of intervention. This is de-radicalization, right? How do you stop someone radicalizing if you've identified that they're radicalizing? There might be a teenager in particular, but you can't, like, they're not at the point where they've committed a crime. You think if you don't intervene, they're going to in the future. That's what radicalization is supposed to mean. But what do you do now? Well, what you do is you put someone in their life who's then going to engage with them and talk to them and like essentially get to know them to figure out like what is their ideology, what is their psychological state, what level of risk do they represent, all according to these bogus models of radicalization. Then share that information with intelligence agencies, police, and then develop some kind of strategy to try and intervene with that person. So you're looking at who's going to be that mentor. Sports coach is a big candidate for that, certainly in the UK, certainly in the US, and I'm sure in Canada as well. So so it's a recruitment of the sports coach to be an adjunct of the national security system, and and obviously that throws up all kinds of complex questions. I mean, for a mental health professional to be recruited into that role, which is what you often see as well. I mean, incredible problems of how do you uphold the best interests of the patient when you're supposed to also be surveilling them, right? So this is the challenges that this kind of counter-radicalization policy throws up, and I think we should be absolutely clear that there should be an absolute barrier between those parts of the public services that are oriented towards surveillance and criminal investigation and preventing crimes, and on the other hand, like all these other professions that have their own particular history of norms that have been developed over time to protect from harm. So whether it's in healthcare about the interests of the patient, whether it's in education, the norm of education is empowerment of that individual through knowledge, not surveillance and criminalization, right? We can't have lecturers being deputized as police spies, right? We have to be absolute there, and especially when what we're being asked to investigate is in any case not based on any credible model of what radicalization is. It's all so I mean, these models of radicalization are lacking in any kind of scholarly substance.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the question about the communities, uh, if they've turned inward, part of it might be because if you're embattled and under surveillance and being reported on and marginalized through these de-radicalization, so-called programs, maybe it's no wonder.
Right.
So certainly a connection there. I just want to mention to people, we do have time for maybe one or two more, hopefully. Dr. Kundnani, you can take one or two more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. But before I get to those last ones, I just want to, mention that on January 28th, we have another event that we're co-organizing with Muslim Awareness Week and organization in Quebec on the 5th anniversary. And that's called, of the Quebec City Mosque Massacre, and that is called Islamophobia, Historical and Global Perspectives on the 5th anniversary. And you can find out more information on our website, on Facebook, and we've dropped the links in the chat. But there were a couple of other questions here. We had Rebecca Gruskin says, many, many thanks. I'm thinking about your helpful description of neoliberalism as a reaction to the 1950s, 60s anti-colonial liberation movements. To what extent should we think of the neoliberal turn as a rupture point? Your account of the racist tropes that first emerged about Arabs and Muslims in the 1960s, 70s reminded me of the British use of air power in 1920s Iraq. I'm also recalling how General Petraeus drew on French colonial military texts about Algeria as a model of successful counterinsurgency in a Muslim place. To what extent do you think it's helpful to layer these chronologies on top of each other? I'd like to think about colonial antecedents while also doing justice to the particularities of neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, and I think the way you put it in that last part of your question is absolutely right about trying to have a bit of balance between the two. So, on the so there is a kind of tendency that we see quite a lot of in how to understand the histories of racism and colonialism, right? There's a tendency that we see quite a lot of to think of, say, white supremacy as as something that's hardwired. This is always the metaphor, right? Hardwired into the West from its formation, hardwired into America since its formation. It's in the DNA. All these kind of metaphors that give it this kind of quality that means that somehow it's just kind of written into the foundations of something like the West. And thereafter it's always the same, and it just kind of plays out and does its thing, and so it kind of flattens out. If we think of it that way, it kind of flattens out how we think about this history. Like racism's always the same thing, kind of, if that's how we think of it. There's something of that. I mean, I have a lot of I think the 1619 project from the New York Times, I think is very useful, and it's like really opening up spaces to think differently about the history of the United States. There is a tendency, though, for it to have this problem that it says that if we just understand what happened in 1619, in this moment when slaves first land in what will become the United States from Africa, and we understand what that was, like, then everything else is just kind of follows mechanically from that moment, right? And so somehow understanding 1619 tells us all we need to know about white supremacy today, at some kind of fundamental level. That seems to me profoundly wrong and politically huge. Politically, what it means is that we not only can't possibly imagine how we can take on racism, because if it's this absolute fixed thing that never changes. We can't imagine changing it. It also erases all the struggles that did have, that forced racism to reinvent itself in new ways, right? That's part of what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about the relationship between decolonization and neoliberalism. Like decolonization didn't, liberate the third world forever thereafter, but it was a victory. It was a victory. It forced them to have to do some work to hold on to some kind of, to develop and build up a new kind of power structure that was going to work in new ways and different ways, right? So what they're doing is reworking a history and a set of paradigms and a set of techniques, all the things you talk about, the counterinsurgency bombing of the early 20th century, things like that. They have all that history as a kind of, as a kind of repertoire. They have to do some thinking, they have to do some working to reinvent how they're going to continue to hold on to what they're going to hold on to, what they have to give up because it can't be held on to anymore, what new things they might grab. I mean, this is always the political process that's going on their side. On our side, we're also doing that, right? We're also constantly reinventing our struggles. We're part of living histories where even if those struggles are inactive and disabled, we pass them on in our stories we tell from our ancestors and onto our children, and one day they get picked up again, right? So, but they never picked up in exactly the same way. They have to be reworked and reinvented as well, right? So we need, and this is, I take this from Stuart Hall and his emphasis on the conjuncture, which I think is the most useful way to think about this. That unless you look very specifically at the particular way in which these historical processes are sedimenting in a particular place in a particular time, then you're kind of never going to be able to really develop a political response to it. And in particular, when you're thinking about racism, the big problem we have in thinking about racism in the United States and Canada and Western Europe is we think of it as a legacy of the past, right? That word legacy, I would like say as a rule, if you're using the word legacy in a sentence about racism, you've misunderstood, you've got a flaw in your reasoning about what racism is, because racism is like part of what I'm trying to say is that neoliberalism generates its own distinctive forms of racism that are specific to this era of neoliberalism that work in different ways and have to be understood differently from what racism would have looked like in say the early 20th century or the 19th century and so on, right? And unless we're doing that, we're fighting. So we're doing one of two things if we're not doing that. Either we're thinking of racism as this kind of hangover from this past, this kind of archaic thing that as time goes on is kind of just going to ebb away because it's like old fashioned, right? Which is it means we've already lost our anti-racist struggles because we're not even seeing how strong and active and powerful the new infrastructures of racism that have been created just in the last few decades are, or we're thinking of racism as this thing that is just always there and can't be changed, right? Because it's just this kind of hardwired, right? I mean, that's what the metaphor means. If you say something's hardwired, if it's hardware, not software, you load whatever software you want onto your computer. You can't change the hardware, right? The idea of it being hardwired, the idea of it being DNA, I don't like these metaphors because I think they disable the possibility that we can do anything about racism.
Well, that's very interesting because in some ways, the very controversy over whether Islamophobia is a form of racism at all is, perhaps indicative, as you're saying, that there are produced new forms. If you're only using the, analytics of, scientific or biological racism generated in 19th or in the 20th century, Black freedom struggle, period, you might miss the ways in which there are new reformulations of culture and ethnicity and race and religion,
Right.
and
Right.
new forms of discrimination that work in neoliberalism. It's a very interesting point. I mean, I think the last point that you were talking about may in fact um, respond to Hedley Myers's last point here. So you can decide whether you want to elaborate on it any further or just any concluding remarks. But he said, or Headley says, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Kundnani. If there were a way to incorporate surplus or unexploitable populations into the capitalist system or into a post-capitalist system, how do you think that would affect racializing discourses with regard to Islam, considering that racial capitalism does not only describe surplus populations?
Okay. I would argue that that if is
How big
that,
if? Yes.
well, it's not just a big if, but it's an impossibility. I think the nature of capitalism is that it's, and this is the racial capitalism argument, right? That the nature of capitalism means it's inherently unable to make itself universal, right? There's always going to be these these surplus populations. It just, if you imagined, if you looked at what capitalism looked like in in the 1860s when Karl Marx is working on Capital, and you look at and you assume, as he tended to do, that capitalism is that system that's emerging in Western Europe is going to be rolled out to the rest of the world, then then you can imagine that it becomes this universal kind of self-contained system that functions, according to the logic that he describes, right? But what he missed is that kind of core of capitalism that emerged in Europe that he describes depended on an outside, right? Like imperialism is the relationship between that inside and that outside. And imperialism is inherent to capitalism, right? It always requires that outside. I mean, this was, Rosa Luxemburg makes this argument for the first time, but then it's elaborated in all kinds of ways in the late 20th century, right? So capitalism always needs this outside of non-capitalism, and that means that it always is going to have some need to organize a kind of infrastructure of what that boundary looks like between capitalism and non-capitalism, and race is the main way that is done. And it's hard to, it's possible for it to be done in other ways while still being capitalism. So that it's not that racial capitalism, it's not that capitalism couldn't be a different kind of capitalism that didn't rely on race to do that work of coding and managing the boundary between capitalism and non-capitalism. But that's always been the way it's been done in capitalism as we know it, and there's no prospect of that not being the case, in the foreseeable future. If that, so it's not so much that can we imagine a capitalism that incorporates all surplus populations. That isn't possible. What we can imagine is a capitalism in which the boundary between surplus and not surplus is not coded racially, right? So I think that would be the hypothetical. It's an abstract hypothetical because that's not foreseeable, but that is a theoretical possibility, I think, within my understanding of capitalism. And the problem is that there would have to be some other kind of system of violence that did the same work. So it's not like we're not imagining a future there that's a more attractive kind of liberatory future for ourselves. I mean, the one that we should be imagining is one that where we don't organize the world according to capitalism. That would be the way out of this. And that might be a good note
to end on. The work ahead. I want to thank you so much for your generosity with your time and for this wonderful talk and the discussion afterwards. and to thank everybody for attending and for posing some wonderful questions. We didn't get people who wanted to, for whatever reason, unmute themselves and ask them directly, but they were eloquent, in the chat, and it was a great discussion. Thank you so much. Look forward to the January 28th event, and do follow us, MSGP, to find out about upcoming events like the one on the 28th and other things that we're organizing for the future. And also do buy The Muslims Are Coming, Verso 2014. You can find it online, directly from Verso. They'll ship to Canada. It's a great book, and also do follow Dr. Kundnani. You have a website, I believe, where people can read examples of your work, short pieces that you publish, as well as news about any upcoming projects. What is that? What is that website, and how should people follow you?
I'll put the website in the chat.
Okay, great.
There you go. And everything's on there.
Okay, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Talk.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.